まだいないと思う。あ、he's online.
He's online?
He's online.
Takashi. So, I'm going to show you the yesterday's, wait a minute. I'll show you the slide.
Oh, yes, please.
Takashi. He doesn't respond.
Maybe did not pick up. Let me see.
Are you sure? Are you sure he's joining?
I think he's online. He's active.
Maybe just only noise. Where he is, maybe he's not in Ho Chi Minh. I think somewhere else, right? Because his connection is not doing well. Huh? Right? Takashi is joining, are you sure?
Well, he's
Let me I'm going to check his
live is on.
I'm going to check. He usually quickly respond to me. How's the interview? You met with ASEAN or Pricewaterhouse. You supposed to meet with CEO. The guy also. You met with him? Yeah. Takashi is here. He just called me. Not you.
すいません、そうなりました。
Takashi, no, not me. Ed. Are you Ed? No. And Ed, okay. I'll go ask him to call, okay? Not me. Okay, just a moment. Just a moment.
切った方がいいですか？
切ってくれる？ Ed will call you. Ed. Huh? Ed.
Yes.
Takashi called me, so I just asked him to cut line. So you just try to call me and Takashi together.
Yes, I will call the line and call you all three. One second.
Okay, so why don't you try to do that?
Yes. not have my sound coming in from my ears. Let me see, otherwise it will be a bit noisy like last time.
Really? So I had better call him?
Yeah, I can join you in a second, but I need to do something about my audio settings, otherwise the recording will not be good.
Okay, how about Takahashi?
Takashi, he is online. You want me to organize the call? Otherwise, then I can organize it as well. But I need to restart Skype.
Okay, why don't you restart Skype? Are you going to do that, or I'm going to do that?
Yeah, I can do that. I will restart Skype.
Okay, restart again.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Unistan is also in.
Oh, yeah. Takashi joined. Takashi, where you are? Ho Chi Minh?
Still Ho Chi Minh, yes.
Oh, okay, so your connection is much better than the other place, right? Okay. So, Eddie, could you fix your problem?
Yes.
Okay.
This should be better.
Okay, so
This should be better. I'm going to see if Yuva is online. Just maybe she's late. No, she's not online.
She's not online. Okay, just forget it. Let's go and start.
Okay.
So this is your slide.
All right. So last Saturday we were looking at Alain de Botton,
right?
Who wrote a book about how can we lessons of consolation. And basically, he focused. He put the questions of life in front, and then looked at those questions and studied 6 philosophers to see who could answer that question. So, how could philosophers answer questions in our daily life?
Mm-hmm. Right.
That, for example, the question of unpopularity, about lack of money, frustration, these kinds of questions that people are coping with on a day-to-day basis. How would the philosophers be able to help us to answer those questions? So we've already looked at Socrates, and he made it. Socrates made it difference between beliefs and truth, and he actually, his method was rather groundbreaking, because he tried to disprove common sense. Common sense were widely held beliefs, but they would not necessarily be true. Even though many people believe them, it doesn't automatically mean that are true. So he introduced his method of questioning people to basically disprove common sense, and he taught us how to think independently. And by thinking independently, we would be able to find the truth. Then after Socrates, we looked at Epicurus on happiness, and basically it looked like his theory was based on material wealth can bring you happiness. But actually Epicurus says no, the true happiness can be found in finding the truth and through true friendship. And so a friendship and camaraderie were central in his teachings, and he's basically he lived in a commune with friends, and he advocated a simple life with autarky. So basically, be self-sufficient, grow your own stuff. You don't necessarily need a lot, just enough to live, because you will not be able to find true happiness if it is through material things, as long as you have enough. So if you remember, he showed the graphs where basically when your material wealth increases a little bit, then your pleasure, your happiness will grow very rapidly, but it tops off very quickly. And the same is true. So what is to be preferred? To be very wealthy, or to have friends? And we saw that a commonly held belief is that money makes happy. Well, he argued that that is not the case. If you are wealthy, but you do not have friends, you do not have anybody in your life, then maybe wealth will not make you happy. So therefore, wealth doesn't make us happy. Also in line with Socrates. So we finished at Epicurus, and today I would like to continue with the video. Kuno-san, would you mind starting the Alain de Botton link? I think we're probably still. It will automatically continue. It was about 30 minutes in the video we were.
That we don't really, so that we'll end up thinking that
29 minutes is
yes, that's correct. That's correct.
That's
yes.
correct. We're going to continue that.
Please.
Something about Bacardi that is great and is going to make us happy, because we've essentially been lured to Bacardi by an unconscious recognition that what we need is friendship. The danger is that we'll end up with a crate of Bacardi in our living room feeling quite unhappy and friendless. So we must take care.
The third philosopher you mentioned is Seneca. You associate him with frustration and his thinkings as a consolation for frustration. Who was he? Where did he live?
Okay, an ancient Roman statesman lived in a time of the emperors Caligula and Nero, and it was a time when the Roman Empire was extremely mighty, but also where life in ancient Rome was very unstable, so that one could suddenly make a lot of money but lose it all of a sudden if one fell out of favor. The Roman Empire was also racked by many natural disasters. Sudden fires destroyed the city of Lyon. Mount Vesuvius exploded. Pompeii was destroyed. There were earthquakes in Calabria, in Liguria. And what Seneca built his philosophy around was attempting to suggest that we had to be prepared for disaster, and by being prepared, would be better able to withstand it. So his philosophy is about literally teaching us to be philosophical about things that go wrong and to be more prepared. Seneca, rather like Socrates, came to an unfortunate end. He was ordered to commit suicide by the Emperor Nero, and rather like Socrates, the scene of his death, the scene of his calmly taking death, has continued to inspire painters. And David, a few years before he painted Socrates meeting his death, painted a canvas of Seneca meeting his death.
And we see it here, and there are others. But you earlier said that Seneca was a Stoic.
That's right.
Where did that word come from, and what is a Stoic?
Well, a Stoic it was a school of philosophy founded by a man called Zeno. Zeno had started philosophizing in the Stoa in Athens. Stoa was literally a kind of covered marketplace, market area. He was teaching his pupils there, and so people described Zeno and his followers as Stoics. And but what soon distinguished the Stoics was this idea that what it was very important to do was to moderate your responses to disaster and be prepared for disaster. And that's why we still today have this image of what it is to take something stoically.
And how do you take something stoically?
Well, one view is that you take it with a stiff upper lip. That's rather pejorative. But the other view is simply that you take it with equanimity.
You talk about frustration. So the consolation, if we learn about Seneca, is what in dealing with frustration?
Right. Well, what Seneca looks at is a number of areas in which people react badly to frustration, and he tries to suggest better ways to cope with frustration, and tries to analyze why we're frustrated. So in one book he considers the subject of anger, why it is that people feel angry. And Seneca believes that if you scratch the surface of any angry person, you'll find a tremendous optimist. So the person who gets angry when they lose their keys in the morning is basically betraying a rather touching but rather naive view of a world in which keys simply don't get lost. The person who shouts when there's a traffic jam is betraying an implicit faith in a world in which cars don't get clogged up in roads. So what Seneca thought it was essential to do is to redraw our map of reality so as to take into account many of the things that do frustrate us, so that they'll shock us less when they occur. To this end, he counseled us to perform what he called a premeditation every morning. That is a meditation on all the kinds of things that could go wrong in the day ahead. He told us to, at one point rather humorously, that we should swallow a toad every morning so as to not see anything more disgusting in the day ahead. We would be well prepared. And generally his view is the more prepared we are for what might go wrong, be it lost keys or indeed a traffic jam, the better we'll be able to respond when that disaster occurs. So it's a kind of it's a philosophy of disappointing yourself rather than letting the world do so, but disappointing yourself in a measured way and in a way that you're in control of, rather than letting life slap you in the face suddenly, and hence provoke bitterness and rage.
I want to read a little piece of the premeditatio, the Latin of the premeditation, that you excerpt for your book. The wise will start each day with the thought, fortune gives us nothing which we can really own. Nothing, whether public or private, is stable. The destinies of men, no less than those of cities, are in a whirl. Whatever structure has been reared by a long sequence of years at the cost of great toil through the kindness of the gods is scattered and dispersed in a single day. No, he who has said, a day has granted too long a postponement to swift misfortune, an hour, an instant of time suffices for the overflow of empires. So we're supposed to recite something like this every day.
That's the kind of flavor of Seneca's own thoughts, yeah.
It sounds like a real downer.
It is a downer, but I think, Seneca believed that it vitally prepares you. And I think it could sound extreme like that. I mean, Seneca says at one point, to mortals have you given birth, and mortal have you been born, so that you should expect everything and reckon on everything. And this might sound quite extreme, but I mean, there are more common sense examples of this. I mean, whenever one approaches an airport, whenever I approach an airport anyway, I go through a little Senecan premeditation, which is, perhaps I'm about to head for some terrible disaster. The plane may crash, but even less catastrophically, there may be the most terrible delay. And that helps me to keep calm, because indeed often one is struck by sudden disasters at airports. And if so long as one's slightly prepared for this, I mean, if one approaches an airport and thinks, I will get to, Washington, D.C. on time. I will be at my gate precisely when, the travel agent told me I would be. One's likely to be really in a rage or feel very bitter about the fact that one's constantly slightly delayed. And so it's simply by preparing yourself for the kind of necessary imperfectibility of existence that you help to avoid some of the frustrations.
You mentioned his use of hyperbole in his writings. What was that about?
Well, he's prone to all sorts of exclamations. I don't know if I can give you an example of the kind of rather florid passages. He tells us, he talks about the figure of fortune determining our life, and he says, whenever anyone falls at your side or behind you, cry out, fortune, you will not deceive me. You will not fall upon me confident and heedless. I know what you're planning. It's true that you struck someone else, but you aimed at me. So he's kind of, it's almost like theatre, and indeed Seneca wrote plays, very good plays too. And one can get the sense that that Seneca is concerned to convey his philosophy in very dramatic, theatrical, literary terms. He believes that it's not just, he can't just make a point rationally. He has to use rhetoric, and he has to use all the powers of art to bring home his message. And I think that's a very interesting view of what philosophers should do.
Is that in contrast to some of the other philosophers you've mentioned?
Not the philosophers that I look at, but it's certainly in contrast to modern-day philosophers who have a view that, you can write more or less as though you're writing a kind of manual for a car when you're writing a book of philosophy, because so long as the thought is nice, it doesn't matter how you say it. Seneca had a much more, I think, realistic picture of the way our minds work, which is that if you give someone a lively image, if you try and help them with the use of metaphor and language, you're very much going to help them to understand an argument and to let that argument continue to be a living presence in their mind.
Well, tell the story of the politics of Rome at the time and how he got caught up in it.
Well, Seneca did come to some sticky moments. He was accused by the Empress Messalina of having had an affair with the sister of Caligula, the ex-emperor, the last emperor. This is in the reign of Augustus, and anyway, this was a very serious charge. Basically, he got caught up in a desire by one faction at court to do down another, and so much so that he was exiled to the island of Corsica very suddenly. All of a sudden, he was stripped of all his worldly goods and was forced onto this island. And what's interesting is just how philosophically he managed to take it, because he had premeditated on this kind of thing. And I think one has to imagine the atmosphere of ancient Rome, perhaps a little bit like modern-day America in terms of the stock market, that one day you could be very rich, but the next day you literally could lose everything. The ground is unstable beneath your feet. And Seneca's philosophy is very much it's interesting that it was very popular among wealthy people, among powerful people, because they're people who know the possibility of sudden extreme collapses in their social position.
And the circumstances of his death?
Basically, he was caught up, I think unfairly, in a plot to kill Nero, whose tutor he had been. Nero was making himself very unpopular among Romans. He probably went mad and started behaving very, very eccentrically, and some army officers decided to try to kill him. The plot was uncovered, and Seneca was implicated in this, and so Nero simply ordered everyone who he even remotely suspected of being involved to commit suicide, and that's why he did. When Seneca heard the news that he had to commit suicide, and he told his family, the family started wailing hysterically, everyone was weeping and shouting, etc. And Seneca urged them to calm down. He said, what need is there to weep over parts of life? He said, the whole of it calls for tears. And this kind of approach to disaster was very typical of him.
Well, you went into some detail about how he died and how long it took and who was there, and it's all depicted in this picture. And as we show that picture again, tell that story.
Well, basically, he was surrounded by his wife, Paulina. His wife was his second wife. She was quite a bit younger than him. She was very beautiful, and from all accounts, they really loved one another. And she was absolutely distraught that her husband had been ordered to commit suicide. She very much respected him. He was an eminent philosopher. She couldn't believe that the mad Emperor Nero was ordering him to kill himself. So she was completely distressed. And when Seneca started to kill himself, Paulina fainted, and then when she recovered, she took a knife to her wrists and started cutting her own wrists. And her argument was that she simply couldn't bear to live without her husband. but her husband told her that this was ridiculous, and tried to get her to accept his death. And in fact, Nero's guards tried to stop Seneca's wife from committing suicide because they didn't wish to add to Nero's already considerable reputation for cruelty. So Paulina did carry on living, but poor Seneca died after a lot of suffering, but he died very bravely, and that's why his death continues to inspire.
Before we leave Seneca, tell the story of Cyrus, the king, who had a little disagreement with a river. And what's Epicurean about that story?
Seneca.
Or Seneca,
yes. Well, Seneca wrote a book called On Anger, in which he considered the extreme actions of many people who were angry and tried to understand what was going on there. One of his favorite examples was the example of Cyrus, the king of Persia, who a few hundred years before Seneca was writing, had decided to invade the Babylonian lands and had raised a huge army from Persia to try and conquer these lands. But when he came across a river that was dividing one half of his territory from the other, he came across this very powerful river which he tried to cross. He was advised by his advisors not to cross the river because it was very perilous at that time of year. It was foaming and dangerous because of the winter rains. But Cyrus was a very omnipotent man. He thought that nothing should defy his authority. So he said, I will cross this, and what's more, I'll cross it on my favorite white horse. He had a white horse which he loved. So he started crossing, and the white horse was taken away by the current instantly, as the advisors had predicted, and swept downstream to his death. Cyrus was absolutely furious with the river for frustrating his intentions, and he decided that the river had done this on purpose, and so he was going to hurt the river for killing his horse. So he ordered his entire army to stop their expedition to Babylon and divert the river, cut it up into 360 tiny channels, so as to make it so weak that a woman could walk across it, he said, without raising her skirts. So he wanted to kill the river for punishing, he wanted to punish the river for killing his horse. And this is an example of the kind of mad behavior that can seize angry people. And what Seneca thought that Cyrus was suffering from was a sense of persecution, a sense of being mocked and ridiculed, and that he believed that this is the kind of thing that leads people to feel very brittle whenever something goes wrong, and that kind of paranoia to suspect that even a river is plotting against you. He thought that basically Cyrus was not a friend to himself, he said, and he believed it was very important to be a friend to oneself if one didn't want to let one's anger get away.
Next on the list is a Frenchman, Michael de Montaigne. He's on the list because he addressed.
All right. So actually, this Seneca, the Stoic, as we call this group of philosophers, is one that advocates people or advises people to be calm, calm in any situation, and to do that, you have to be prepared. So you always have to be prepared for the worst, because if you are prepared, you're able to deal with it much more calmly than when you are unprepared. So Stoics, they seem to be very negative, have a very negative outlook for life, but the objective for that was that once you are prepared, then you can moderate your response. Anger, as he argues, is basically the result of people not being ready, who are naive about the world. Like, we are all mortal people, so we should be prepared for death. Yet, a lot of people are taken by surprise. So everything that can go wrong may go wrong. Therefore, you better be ready. He was a good writer, a poetic writer, a little bit like in the tradition of Aristotle. And his life was he led a court life. He was surrounded by a lot of wealthy and influential people, who could identify with what he wrote about, the anger and the frustration, because the wealth was not very stable. Fortunes were gained and lost sometimes in a day. Also, considering the emperors at the time, like Nero and Caligula, who had who left a very bad reputation. They were basically mad and very, very unstable. Seneca was killed. Of course, he was prepared for that. He was forced to commit suicide. He was prepared for that because from his own Stoic perception, he knew that this could come, and therefore he did not respond very strongly to his own death, even though it was a very painful one. Now this idea of being calm in response to adversity is something that we also see in Confucius. Confucius also teaches us to be stable and calm. I think that Confucius has a different message when it comes to how to become calm and stable through education, by actually training yourself, by being patient, managing your family, by education. The Stoics also prophesied to be calm in adversity, but they more or less gave the advice to just imagine everything that can go wrong. That if it will go wrong, you will be able to respond better.
What is the difference among Confucius and Seneca? Is patient? But what's the difference?
Well, the difference is basically the Stoics, Seneca and the Stoics. It's actually a school in philosophy. There are more Stoics than Seneca. Basically, I believe that for Confucius, the road to Stoicism, the road to calmness, even though times are very tough, are more in endurance, patience, building up virtues of wisdom, which will allow you to make adversity relative, to be able to deal with adversity as it comes. Doesn't necessarily mean that you are prepared for the event as it occurs, but your wisdom will help you to.
You're talking about Seneca?
No, I'm talking about Confucius.
Oh, Confucius is more. Oh, he said that if you get patient, you need to study many years.
So that's Confucius. So he basically believed that if people train themselves, if through education, through studying, through patience, through basically coming closer to yourself, being more through managing your family by enduring your wife and how she sometimes may be unreasonable, by training yourself constantly, you can become better at controlling your emotions. Seneca was more or less like, okay, well, negative things is something that we can expect. I mean, death is something that we can expect, because we are all mortal human beings. The chances that you will be involved in a traffic accident are always there. So if it happens, why would you panic? Because if your mind is prepared for a traffic accident every day, you will be much better at coping with a traffic accident as it happens. So the Stoics basically made a point of looking ahead and taking all the risks that we run as human beings into consideration, and well, picture what it would be and how you would be able to cope with a situation like that.
So, yeah, Confucius said is that you should study many years. But how about he recommended? Seneca recommended.
He Seneca recommended to always be prepared, not necessarily through wisdom or through patience, but by simply facing the reality that you're running all kinds of risk in your daily life. So don't be surprised by it. Don't be caught up by surprise, but just make sure that you prepare yourself for anything that can go wrong. And then when it goes wrong, you will be able to deal with it much more calmly.
He just give us caution, warnings to watching out for the frustration. Then you must be careful about this, right?
Yes, because frustration is and anger and losing your mind doesn't help you in adversity. It actually will blur your senses, and it could actually make things a lot worse. People who lose their head can do stupid things, like he gave the example of Cyrus of Persia, who was a very well respected emperor, who lost his head, who lost his temper, and started to behave very foolishly because he basically became irrational. He felt that he had been controlled by the river, and that should not be a thing. But on the other hand, he could have expected this to happen and could have responded much calmly. His horse had already died, so that it didn't make any sense for him to actually mobilize all his troops to divert the river. This was irrational behavior and would not have been necessary if he were prepared for the fact that it was actually possible that the river might wash him away.
But that he said just gives us a lot of examples and some cautions for the people. But I think this is very difficult to transfer those caution into people's mind without practice, or just only listening he's saying. It's very difficult to execute what he said to the current actual practice, right?
It is rather tough. Stoics, it's a school in philosophy. It still lives. There are actually quite a few followers of Stoicism.
Quite a few.
And it's quite a few. But in general, the practice you can practice it at all kinds of levels, of course. But for example, always be prepared by expecting the worst. Could be a very good approach when you are managing a project, for example. Because when the worst happens, you need to be prepared. What if a natural disaster would hit us? How are we going to respond to that? A lot of people are not prepared for that because they say, well, it's so unlikely. But any likelihood, anytime it will occur, if you are not prepared for that, if you have not considered it, you need to start thinking at that time, and that might be too late.
He doesn't have disciples?
Yeah, he does. Actually, there are quite a few disciples, and even today, Stoicism is popular. I'm reading a book that doesn't go very fast, but I'm reading a book about Stoicism. It's being sold quite well.
Really? So, you have read it?
Yeah, I'm reading it, but I'm not very far yet in the book. But I think it's a very interesting philosophy. I tend to be very optimistic, so that means that I'm very often not prepared for bad things to come.
I see. It's amazing. I didn't know that, but I think very similar to Confucianism. And,
right.
But all the way we need to study patience for many years.
Right.
The reason why
patience.
Calm. They said calm, and Confucianism said calm and serenity.
Right.
Okay, so you will going to, it means cultivate self.
Right.
So finally you can do well with your family.
Right. So I think that the Confucian, to be calm, to be serene, actually it's premeditation, to project, to look at the future and to see where you are and to take all the risk into consideration will make you much happier. So if you swallow every morning, we should swallow a toad, is what he says. That means that if you have done the worst that you can imagine, then everything else after that might seem quite easy. And it's a rather simple philosophy. It's not so strange. I mean, one of the reasons for me to take a motorcycle trip through Africa by myself was that actually, if to do something so scary that after that I would not be afraid of anything anymore. It's more or less the same idea.
This is very interesting. Just in the morning, spend 20-30 minutes for just very calm. This is like Buddhist. The power of Zen.
Right.
Spiritual.
Right. And they both actually advise people, or both have the same objective in mind, to be calm and at all times. And the only difference between the two is that they see slightly different ways in achieving calmness, but the value and the virtues of calmness are at the center of their teachings.
Could you explain me again I couldn't understand the last, his example. He's speaking of example. What he said?
Basically, what he says is that he was talking about Cyrus of Persia. Cyrus was the king of Persia, very much respected by Alexander the Great. If I'm not mistaken, he was his hero, and Alexander the Great very much respected Cyrus. But there was a legend about Cyrus that he wanted to invade Babylon, which is basically he was from Iran. He wanted to invade Iraq. And in order to do that, he mobilized an army. And when he had to cross a river, I think the river that runs between Iraq and Iran is the Euphrates. But anyway, the point was that the river was very wild, and his advisors told him not to cross the river because he might be killed. He said, well, he was a very confident man, and he had a very big ego. And he says, well, there's nothing that's going to stop me, and I'm going to cross this river. I'm not going to be stopped by a river, and I will cross it with my best horse, with my favorite horse. So he crossed the river, and in line with the warnings of his advisors, the water took control of the horse and swept away the horse, and the horse got killed. Cyrus was not killed, but he was so angry that he told his soldiers all to come to the river and divert it. That means that basically change the way the water flows within the river by diverting it and diverting it. So they were ordered to divide the streams of the river from one stream into 360 very small streams, so that anyone could cross that river in even a lady would not even have to take off her shoes to cross the river.
So what he did? So he how he stopped the stream of river?
Oh, basically, if you take the force of a river and you divide it by 2, then the force for every half will become half. Then you divide it by 2 again, and then by 2 again, and by 2 again. So he asked them to divide it by 360. So there would be 360 very small streams. Every small stream could be taken easily, but the one big stream was very violent.
Oh, he said that he did separate streams.
Yes, exactly. He separated the streams, but of course that doesn't make much sense, because it was only at that time that the river was that wild, because it was in the spring, and the river was very strong and very wild in the summer, and to cross the river would not have been so dangerous. It was also very irrational, because he needed his army to conquer Babylon, not to divert the river, but it was basically his anger. Because he was not prepared to be defeated by the stream of the river, even though it was a serious possibility, even though he was warned for that. That made him act irrational, and thereby losing basically his sanity.
Mm. By the way, what is the relationship with Seneca's message?
The relationship is that we should.
He's just anger, right? Anger is bad.
Right, but he was angry because he was not prepared to be defeated by the river. And what Seneca says, you should always be prepared, because that was a possibility. So he did not prepare himself. Therefore, he could not respond rationally.
I see. Okay. How about Takashi? Do you understand?
Yeah.
Could you follow that?
Yeah.
Okay. So
let's continue.
Yeah, continue.
Yes, please.
Okay. Just move. I'm looking for the house. Okay.
In your mind,
yes, please.
Our feelings or our concerns about inadequacy. Who was he? Where did he live, and when?
Okay, he's a 16th century statesman. Not statesman. Well, he was mayor of Bordeaux for 2 terms, but basically he was more of a private citizen. He lived in the 16th century near Bordeaux in a wonderful castle. And what's interesting about him is that he was very modest about what it is to be a good human being. Ancient philosophers had kind of suggested that a wise life was quite a heroic thing. And Montaigne wanted to bring us down to earth and create a more realistic picture of what human beings are like. He believed that frequently our picture of what it is to be human is simply too exalted. To give you some more sort of concrete examples, he believes that we're simply not frank enough often about the role of the body in our lives. He asks us to imagine what Plato could have done if he'd been struck by a need to fart at a symposium, and his answer is not very much. That the need to fart is something that even in a great wise man like Plato can completely overpower us. As he put it at another point in his essays, kings and philosophers shit, and so do ladies. And he also said that even when we're sitting on the highest throne, we're seated still upon our arses. And he spoke in this very sort of pungent and frank way in order to try and bring home these simple but I think very wise and important truths.
Why do we even know about him?
We know about him from a wonderful book which he wrote entitled The Essays. And in this book he undertook a very curious project, which was basically to write about himself, to write down his own philosophy of life as it had emerged from his reading and also from his own experience. Very few people had ever been so personal in a book as Montaigne. But Montaigne thought that all of us speak, as it were, from our own bodily selves and from our own experience. And so we mustn't, when we write books, pretend that we're writing from sort of abstract position. This is why Montaigne's book is filled with rather amusing and rather touching sort of homey details about him. He tells us when he likes to go to the bathroom, what he likes to eat, his relationship to certain fruits, the fact that he used to like melon but now no longer likes melon, that he likes to brush his teeth a lot. All these kind of details are intertwined in discussions about, the great philosophers and history and religion, and really what he's trying to do is to show the interconnection between the high and the low, I suppose. And he's a wonderful guide to reconciling ourselves to, as it were, the extremes of human life, the ridiculous and the sublime.
How does he compare himself with the other philosophers that preceded him?
Well, he takes a lot from the philosophers that preceded him. He, for example, was a great admirer of Seneca. He believed that Seneca was very much to his taste. He read him constantly. He read Epicurus a lot. He loved Socrates. But where he distinguishes himself is his note of skepticism about our powers of mind. He's not as optimistic about someone. He's not as optimistic as someone like Seneca. He's aware of just how much we can't control. He wants to let the farts have their say, as it were.
What was the reception of these essays when they were published? Were they published during his lifetime?
They were published towards the end of his life, and very early on he was recognized as having done something very special, and he's remained a figure who almost exemplifies what it is to be a great French writer. I think he's particularly French in his fusion of emotion and reason, in his mixture of the everyday and the more exalted. He's almost where he lived is a wonderful combination of the north and the south in all the extremes of temperament. The more rational north, the more sensual south. Bordeaux is situated between the north and the south, has the climate both of the north and the south, a very temperate climate, and all of these things I think influenced Montaigne.
He may be French, but he wasn't entirely positive about the French. You've got a chapter on cultural inadequacy where the French, his countrymen, don't come off so well. What's that about?
Well, like all great Frenchmen, he hated France. All great Frenchmen hate France. Flaubert, Proust, they all rant against France. Stendhal, and yet, there's a lot of affection nevertheless. But what he hated about France is, I think, what a lot of people find troublesome about France, which is its chauvinism, the pride that a lot of French people have in their own manners and morals, their belief that they do everything better than anyone else. This enraged Montaigne, and Montaigne did a lot of travelling and believed that travelling is very vital to anyone's education, because it helps to release you from a feeling that your own customs are central to the universe. And Montaigne was writing at a time when South America had just been discovered, and the customs of the natives of the Americas were coming in for a lot of ridicule. They were described as savages, as children, as mere animals, and were being slaughtered in their thousands and millions indeed by the Spanish colonists. Montaigne was a very early defender of the intelligence and humanity and integrity of the natives of the Americas, and really took the side of the Indians against the Europeans. And this was typical of his immense broad-mindedness towards what is new and what is different, and really set him apart from his contemporaries.
How would his essays of that day compare to memoir today?
Well, I think what's interesting about Montaigne is that he's not simply a memoirist in the sense he's not simply telling us his life just for the sake of it. He's a psychologist as well, and a philosopher and a historian. He wraps big thoughts in the middle of anecdotes about himself. He uses himself really as a springboard to greater thoughts. He's not simply interested in telling us about himself for the sake of it, and there's a note slightly of narcissism in a lot of memoirs written today. This was very far from what Montaigne was doing. He was talking about himself, but in order really to generalize and to discover more about the human condition, he famously said that each man carries within him the whole of the human condition, so that by studying ourselves well, we have access to really all the possibilities of all human beings. And that's why he thought that he was a fit subject for study. But he was not. He was very self-aware and was not talking about himself simply to puff himself up.
Talk about where he wrote and how he wrote. Earlier we showed the audience a picture of a round tower that you referred to as a castle.
He wrote in a lovely tower at one end of his castle. He had the whole tower to himself, and the room was given over to about 1,000 books, which lined the shelves.
Was that unusual for that time?
Very unusual, for a huge library. And he had a desk in the middle of the room, and he would do a lot of pacing. And on the ceiling of his room, of his study, he had a number of quotations culled from the classics and from the Bible that were designed to bring him down to earth. So as he would look up at these quotations, he would be reminded of the weakness of the human condition. These quotations say things like, have you ever seen a man who thinks he's wise? You have more to hope for from a madman than from him. A quote from Ecclesiastes that was up on the wall. He also had a quote from Plutarch, where Plutarch says that everything is too complicated for human beings to understand. So a lot of kind of down-to-earth statements on his study ceiling.
His thoughts on education.
He believed that education goes wrong a lot of the time, that what we are taught to study and the dominant criteria that we use to evaluate how clever someone is are totally corrupt. He believed that the youth of France would be better employed playing tennis than going to most schools and universities, because he thought that what we are taught at school and university are facts. We are not taught the capacity to interpret and to live wisely, and he believed that what knowledge should do is to teach us to be wise, and he thought that this was a task that education simply had neglected in the name of a rather specious focus on acquiring knowledge just for its own sake, for snobbish reasons.
Now, you offer here in your book an examination in Montaignian wisdom, that is a kind of a test that a school child ought to be given. Is that your own creation, or is it directly taken from his writings?
I take quotations from Montaigne, because Montaigne says at some point that the examinations that people have set are completely useless.
Well, then give us the flavor of your examination.
And so what I do is pick up various examples various examples of conduct in daily life that Montaigne discusses in his book, and to which he gives various interpretations. And what I do is use these as a springboard to potential examination questions. So, for example, at one point, he talks about a man who's got a very small penis, and he's very upset by this, and runs into all sorts of trouble. And what Montaigne tries to do is to suggest what a man with a small penis might be able to do in order to make his love life go better. So one exam question is, and he calls a small penis, rather touchingly calls it a small living reality. So in my exam question paper, I asked, well, what should a man with a small living reality do when he finds himself in a bedchamber?
The presumption being that this would help him lead or solve the problem in real life.
That this is a legitimate subject of discussion. That rather than simply spending years of our school time and university years studying very abstract questions, that these are quite urgent questions. The question of a small living reality deserves to be on the syllabus.
Is that the overarching theme of his philosophy, bringing it down to the experience we all have on a daily basis?
Very much so, which I think is another reason why he talks so much about himself, to kind of legitimate a personal presence in a book. When he talks about the fact that he likes melon, he doesn't really think we're going to be interested in the fact he likes melon. He believes that it's important for us to bring the melon-eating dimension of ourselves into serious discussions and serious conversation, because that's where they belong.
I want to ask you about his thoughts on books, because well, you'll see why. He says that there are more books on books than on any other subject. All we do is gloss each other. All is a swarm with commentaries. Of authors there is a dearth. This book, in a sense, is it not, a book on books? Mm. And what is he trying to say, and do you fall into his critique?
Right. Basically, if you went today to a university and you said, I'd like to write a thesis on anger, me and anger, me and when I get angry, you'd be laughed off the stage. If you went to university and said, look, I'd like to write a thesis on Aristotle and anger, fine, the doors would be open. But basically, the dominant system of education allows us to discuss questions, the big questions of life, only via certain authorities. We are only allowed to write commentaries on people. So it's fine to write about things, so long as you do so via a big name. Montaigne, this was exactly the same situation in Montaigne's day. And Montaigne thought that this was a very depressing situation, because what it means that we do is simply concentrate only on what other people have said. we don't analyze ourselves. We always reaching it up to the shelf and going, well, what did Aristotle think? What did so-and-so think? And so what he wants us to do is to move from the position of being commentators, i.e. studying other people, to the position of being authors, i.e. people who study themselves, as well, of course, as other people, but also themselves, and use their own experiences to come to truths, use themselves as a sounding board. I make this point in my book in a rather ironic way, because, as you say, what I'm doing is writing a work of commentary, although I suppose what I'm trying to do, this comes at the end of my chapter on Montaigne, is to kind of both free myself and the reader to say, I'm saying I'm writing a commentary now, but, let's move on. And I think Montaigne's point is immensely relevant even to that.
Do you think that your publisher would have accepted it? Say you'd followed Montaigne's advice. He came to you in a dream, and he says, Mr. de Botton, write your own book. Write about you. Would that book have been published?
I think if I'd gone to my publisher and said, I'm going to write about the consolations of my philosophy.
Yes.
I believe they would have been a lot more skeptical. There's a general timidity about, an original authorial voice. We're very afraid to get up there on stage and actually just say what we think, and that's what Montaigne wanted to encourage us to do.
The next philosopher in your list is Arthur Schopenhauer.
Please.
He's
next one is
next one is Schopenhauer.
Oh, Schopenhauer.
Schopenhauer is the next one.
Oh, this portion I don't understand what he said.
Okay. Actually, he talks about Montaigne. Montaigne is a French guy who lived in Bordeaux, which is in the southwest part of France. And he lived in the 16th century.
Is he a philosopher? Is he a philosopher? Montaigne.
He is a philosopher. Yes,
okay.
He is a philosopher.
Okay.
And in his writings, he writes very deep commentary on philosophers, but at the same time, he writes about very mundane things, about how he liked melon but doesn't like it so much anymore, and how he likes to brush his teeth. And
he said lemon.
Yes, and how he likes to brush his teeth, and how basically we should actually not take ourselves too seriously. Even kings' hearts, even celebrities, important people need to go to toilet. So what he does is actually he combines very mundane, very day-to-day truths and simplicity about human imperfection with a very serious philosophy. The point is that he says, okay, don't take yourself too serious. Basically, we are all imperfect human beings, and don't take yourself too seriously. Have an open mind, and don't try to only rationalize yourself. Be rational, but also give room for emotion. He did not believe, and he really argued against the elitist way of thinking, because it would limit ourselves if we believed in superiority of some people. He hated France's chauvinism, because France was not. A lot of people in France believe that France is a superior country with superior culture and superior human beings, but that's very stupid. People in France have their limitations as well. So another thing, and that's very interesting, and that I think is very interesting also relative to Confucius, is that actually also in line with that elite way of thinking, but actually study yourself and you will know humanity. That means that if you basically take your own questions in life, the own things that you encounter. Like, for example, I liked melon, but not anymore. That could be a serious topic for study. So where does it come from? And should I maybe I should dig a little bit deeper into the why of that. He gave the example of the guy with a small living reality, or in other words, a small penis, and says, okay, we can educate people all we want about philosophers and other things, but basically the problem that this guy had actually deserves serious study. So don't be too snobbish in education. Really try to study yourself, because you will learn a lot, not only about yourself but also about humanity. These are really real questions that face humanity. Education now is very much about copy and paste, where we cannot say anything original because we need to stand on the shoulders of our predecessors. If we want to say something about philosophy, we need to put it in the context of previous philosophers, but that's not necessary. So just study yourself, look at your own imperfections, look at your own challenges, and write something, or at least study it and become wiser in the process. So basically, what he introduced is and this is the same as Confucius, is that you need to study yourself, that you need to educate, you need to start small, and then by starting small, you will basically learn the skills that will help you to understand life as a whole much better.
By the way, I have a question. He said rational and emotional. What does mean?
Rational and emotional. Basically, what he says is that we cannot ignore the emotional, the imperfections of human beings. Like the Stoics and Seneca before, basically, he prophesied, or he advised people to always be rational, because for whatever adversity will hit you, it could have been foreseen because it was a possibility. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. Now, if you are rational as a human being, you're always prepared for the worst, then you can deal with it much better when the time comes, and that adversity strikes you. Montaigne was more like, okay, well, there is nothing wrong with having emotions, but there's also the necessity to reason. But you should just study them as they are. You are a human, therefore you have emotions, and you have a rational side. And just deal with it and study it and try to get a grip of it and try to understand yourself a little bit better, and you will know more about humanity.
It means consider a balance between rational and emotional?
Yes, exactly.
It is exactly Confucius said.
Right. This comes close to Confucius. So at the time, philosophers tended to be very, well, maybe with the exception of Aristotle before, who also gave a lot of room for irrational behavior, but other philosophers were more strict in rational reasoning. He balanced it really by on the one hand being very, very analytical and taking reference from a lot of other philosophers, but at the same time also advocating to look very, very simple and to take those simple everyday problems into consideration, and try to learn something from it. Actually, Alain de Botton, during this interview, it was not, he did not start this, but nowadays, he is more or less doing the same thing. School of Life, which is basically looking at all kinds of everyday problems and trying to find an answer from the philosophers, how to deal with those questions, how to deal with those everyday stupid small things. But it's a rather interesting series. It's a YouTube channel.
Actually, okay.
Okay. Maybe we have time for Schopenhauer.
Are you going to?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Consolation for a broken heart. Who was he? Where did he live?
Schopenhauer was a 19th century German who lived in Frankfurt, and he's interesting in that he's one of the first philosophers to really talk a lot about love. You know, what is love? Why do we spend so much time thinking about it? A lot of philosophers have simply neglected this area of life. Schopenhauer, who himself was both obsessed by love and yet had rather unhappy life, I suppose nowadays one would say he had trouble getting a date, he spent a lot of time thinking about what love is, why we spend our time worrying about it, etc. He was also rather a pessimist, although I think in an interesting way. One of his key insights that he begins by asking us to imagine, or by asking us to reflect on the fact that we all know people who get together in a relationship with people who they would never have been friends with. And yet they come to us and they say, I'm in love with Joe, with Mary. And yet we can see from the outside that, you know, they would not be friends with this person, that this person seems to go against everything they hold dear, etc. Schopenhauer asks us not to be surprised by this, and he sees this as absolutely central to what love is. He thinks that there are two projects which we're engaged with in life. The project to find people we get on with, the project to have nice, cozy times with people. And that this is what we're determined to do at a kind of conscious level. But he believes that unconsciously we're driven by a blind biological urge to reproduce the next generation, to have children. And he believed that the criteria by which we choose our mate for producing children is very different to what we would ideally choose if we were simply concerned with having a nice time with someone. And that's why it is that we often find people getting together with people who they aren't really friends with. They're doing so for the sake of the children, but they're blind to urge. So a couple of generations before Freud, Schopenhauer was pointing out that there are largely unconscious reasons why we choose certain people to fall in love with, and that these reasons are not open to us to interpret at a conscious level. And he believed that by understanding the mechanism of love, why it is that we fall in love, we'll be a lot less surprised by love, and a lot less surprised by the many difficulties we often have by the way that we can fall very intensely in love with someone, and then a few years later, once the kids are there and they're running around, and we find we have nothing to say to the person seated across the table from us, the person who we felt we were so in love with a few years before. What's happened? Schopenhauer would tell us this is actually quite normal, sad, but normal. And I think there's a consoling dimension to this darkness.
What was his attitude toward divorce, if you know?
Well, divorce was not really an option in his day, unfortunately. So
did he address it?
He didn't address it because it wasn't a possibility.
You talk about his background. What was it? What did he do for a living?
He wrote philosophy books. He had a private income, which enabled him to get through. He wanted to join the ranks of academia, but was persistently rejected. People found his philosophy simply not what they wanted to hear at the time. So he kept getting turned down. He had a rather lonely, miserable life. He got turned down for many academic posts, and just really lived very privately as a private scholar in Frankfurt. Every morning he'd get up and go to his club, and then he'd have a big lunch, and he'd read the Times every morning, the Times of London. He believed it was the paper that would most accurately reflect the miseries of the world, which he felt were legion and needed to be read about. And he was rather sort of comically gruff and disgruntled.
Was he happy?
I think he had a kind of twinkle in his eye as he kept telling us that life is totally miserable. I think he achieved by the end of his life a measure of satisfaction, because towards the end his books did become great bestsellers.
Did he ever marry?
He didn't marry. He had a number of relationships, but never married.
In your book, you cite that in 1818 he finishes The World as Will and Representation, which he knows to be a masterpiece. It explains his lack of friends. And you quote him, "A man of genius can hardly be sociable, for what dialogues could indeed be so intelligent and entertaining as his own monologues?"
That's right. It's typical of his kind of dark, bitter thoughts. I mean, he's saying this with a slight twist of humor.
But do his purported friends take it as such?
I'm not sure. We don't know. We don't know. But I think we have to see him as a man facing huge opposition to his ideas which are clearly very wise, but in his own day met with opposition. And I think his book sold 230 copies when it came out, and he needed some consolation for that.
And even then, that's not very many books.
It's not very many.
This idea of him being successful later in life, what is it that put him over the top, so to speak, in terms of his name and rank as a philosopher?
Well, he wrote a wonderful book, which sadly is out of print, called Parerga and Paralipomena. Not exactly a best-selling sort of title. Nevertheless, this became a bestseller. It was filled with wonderful considerations on topics of daily life.
What does it mean?
It means Parerga. I think it's assorted thoughts and observations. That's what it means. And in this book are thoughts on what to do about money, fame, women, love, death, suicide, kind of topics of everyday life and death were addressed, and it hit a huge chord in the German public, and he became a big bestseller. Was taken up particularly by writers and artists who relished him. Philosophers have always been a little bit suspicious of him, but he's always met with great approval among people of literary tastes.
I'm still not sure I understand what it is we take away from Arthur Schopenhauer, what his philosophy is that would provide consolation in the case of losing in love.
Let me give you a quote which may help to give you the kind of the flavor of what the sort of consolation. I mean, let's see if you find this consoling. You might not do. I find it oddly consoling when he tells us that there is only one inborn error, and that is the notion that we exist in order to be happy. So long as we persist in this foolish inborn error, the world will seem to us full of contradictions. So much would be gained if through timely advice and instruction, all young people could have eradicated from their minds the erroneous notion that the world has a great deal to offer them. So classes in disappointment is what Schopenhauer thought we needed. I read that and I think this is quite fun. I think that there are, very much we live in a culture where you think that in order to cheer someone up, what you need to tell them is, life is beautiful, life is great, etc. Schopenhauer more wisely recognizes that sometimes what we really need to hear is not life is great, but this is really terrible. Life does seem a bit of a vale of tears, and we can sometimes come away from a dark thinker like Arthur Schopenhauer weirdly cheered in a way that we wouldn't be from reading, Chicken Soup for the Soul.
Well, let's analyze that. I understand that you might say, things are pretty bad. So and you should accept that, how does that make the receiver feel better?
Basically, because often what happens when we feel unhappy is we feel uniquely cursed. We feel that we are unhappy, but the world is beautiful. So this is why people tend to commit suicide at Christmas more than at other times. Why do they commit suicide at Christmas? Because the dominant view of Christmas is everyone's having a good time. And so if you're not having a good time, you think there's really something wrong with me. Now, if at Christmas time we picked up Schopenhauer, we'd be quite consoled, because Schopenhauer tells us things like, life is pretty miserable. And that helps to correct the often unwittingly cruel optimism that surrounds the kind of the sort of vision of what life is like, in which we're all supposed to be smiling and cheerful, and everything's supposed to be fine and hunky-dory. Often it can't be, and I think it's nice to pick up a thinker who commiserates with us about how difficult life is, and also who exaggerates slightly.
Is it really true that his major work is out of print?
The World is Will and Representation, or Parerga and Paralipomena. Parerga and Paralipomena is quite a long book. It's been cut up into little books, and that now gets sold with titles like The Wisdom of Arthur Schopenhauer, which sort of is in print, but the whole thing is out of print.
What do you think about books like Chicken Soup for the Soul and the like?
Well, I love the idea that a book will in some way help you to feel better. I think this is a very noble ambition of self-help books. That said, I think most self-help books are a disaster. They're patronizingly written. They hammer home one message. They do so in a very irritating and shallow way. So I think I'd like to say that, I love the ambition of many self-help books. I think that the execution goes terribly wrong. And what's nice about the philosophers I look at is that what they were doing was writing, I suppose, a superior kind of self-help, that they didn't see. Self-help is a ridiculed genre among people of education nowadays in America. And yet, someone like Seneca, a first-rate mind, saw the writing of books on consolation for poverty or unhappiness as, a legitimate intellectual enterprise. And nowadays, culture is split into, on the one hand, self-help books, which are considered completely trashy, and on the other, academic tomes, which are considered and are indeed unreadable.
Because, a lot of these books are huge bestsellers. Do they ultimately do harm?
It's very hard to say. I'm sure that some of them, no, I mean, I'm sure that, many of them do a little bit of good. I just think they could probably do a lot better.
Our next philosopher in your book, as a consolation for difficulties, is Friedrich
Nietzsche.
The last one.
Okay. No, Nietzsche is not the last one yet, but
really?
the first about Schopenhauer.
Oh, yeah. He handling love.
Yes, he's talking about love. He's talking about why love relationships can go so terribly wrong. The reason is that love is actually it's irrational. It's a biological urge to reproduce. People do not find their mates based on rational behaviors as they do when they are looking for friends, but love is a different drive. Basically, what he observes is that people who get married not necessarily would be friends in the first place. Basically, it's no surprise that relationships go bad because the way you select your partners is irrational and is driven by other motives. In general, he's a little bit of a bitter writer. For example, he says about his about friendship. Brilliant people do not have friends. Why not? Because basically, friendship exists on a conscious level. Now, if you are of superior consciousness, if you are of superior intelligence, then what conversation can possibly inspire you to become friends with somebody else if your intellect is superior to others? So therefore, brilliant people are doomed to be lonely. But in general, he says, well, okay, you know what? Actually, life kind of sucks on many different levels. But get over it. Basically, that's it. We can be very optimistic and say, oh, you know what, everything will be okay and life is beautiful. But it's not. So let's not pretend it is. And actually, that will make it much easier to go through life and accept life as it comes, because it's not always it's not always a happy affair, and it's not supposed to be.
I can't understand why he said we cannot make friends.
Well, basically, he says, well, friendship is based on to make friends is on a conscious level. But if you take that to the extreme, you can say that, well, okay, well, if it is a matter of consciousness, there are people who of very high intellect who have superior consciousness, superior awareness, and so he says, well, if you are of superior consciousness, so how can you become friends with anybody else?
Why?
Because nobody will inspire you, because they don't have the same level of consciousness. So any conversation with these kinds of people will be rather boring, and they will not inspire you to become friends.
Oh, it seems to be ridiculous.
So he's like pessimist.
Yes.
Or pessimist, or he he believes himself too much.
Well, actually, and this is where Botton actually has a kind of different opinion. Reading it at face value, you might say that, but what he says about Schopenhauer, he says, I believe that he had a twinkle in his eyes. He drove home his point that life is not always a happy affair, but he kind of also written his book with a certain level of irony. So he may have taken a more extreme position than he actually felt he would in order to make his point, and sometimes made his statements and his writings with a quite a big dose of irony. So we should actually interpret his writings with a little grain of salt sometimes.
Because he lost lots of love affairs because of he could not understand woman's mind, and he is
basically he says, because when it comes to women, I'm not a rational human being. I'm driven by biological
attitude,
desires, attitude, and not so much. My mind doesn't control me. It's my drive to reproduce that drives me.
Finally, what is his message?
His message is that life sucks, so better deal with it, better accept it. You will be more miserable if you are trying to pretend that life is supposed to be happy, because it's not. And if you do not take that as a premise that life should always be fantastic, then it will be much easier to digest than if you are convinced that life should always give you happiness.
You mean more optimistic?
Yeah, well, basically, it's just like, okay, don't slap yourself in the face if you're not happy. It's just part of life, and it's not abnormal. You should not have to. You don't have to worry about it. It's just the reality that life is not always fun. So get over it.
Okay.
So that's basically his message, I think.
So
life sucks. So get over it.
What he said for love? What is thinking approach for love?
Well, his thinking approach for love is this: okay, love is love. There's a lot of unhappiness in love, and the reason for that is that when we are choosing our mate, then we are not driven by rational behavior. We are driven by irrational behavior, by emotions, and therefore, once we have chosen a partner, it's very likely that later on that relationship will not be a happy one, because we were not thinking clearly.
That's the reason why he cannot get married, right?
Exactly. And he was not very happy with that. So, on the one hand, he was rather a loner. On the other hand, I think I kind of agree with Botton that he probably presented his case with more rigor, a little bit of hyperbole to bring home his point, and to actually then what he really believed about life itself. He also he was not happy in his love life. That's true.
Why he so get famous in this area, in the philosophy? Why he's got his name, fame? Why?
Well, that's a good question. I know this, and I know this part because it was in the video. I did not really study Schopenhauer in much detail. I'm not sure about his main theories because I cannot imagine that this is his main theory and this is the source of his happiness. I think in general, I think his idea is okay. Life's not always a happy affair, so don't expect it to be happy, and you will be much better in dealing with it. But I don't know whether this is the only thing that he wrote about, and to be honest with you, I would not be able to answer that question with much authority.
I think a lot of people accepted his pessimistic thinking way for love. A lot of people lost love, so those people read his book, he agreed with what he said.
Right.
Right? Maybe.
Right. Yeah, so he didn't write very well. But he didn't sell very well. He sold about 138 copies in total of his book, and he tried to become a successful writer. But later in life, his books became very, very popular, even though not fully accepted in academic circles. But the general public very much embraced.
Oh, I see. Understandable. Okay. So we will continue next Saturday, right?
Please.
Okay.
Yes,
Takashi, do you have any opinion?
It's okay. Yes.
Okay. So you whole week you're staying in the Saigon. What do you mean?
Yeah, we'll be few days in Hanoi.
Huh? You're there.
I'll be in Hanoi few days this week.
Okay, Ed. So thank you very much for today. So
Thank you very much.
By the way, next Monday session, you're going to have September. I just announced September 17th.
17th, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
17th. Okay,
correct.
I'm correct. Okay. So thank you very much for today. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Gentlemen,
Thank you.
see you Saturday.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
So thank you. Bye.